We're going to tie a Pat's rubber legs today, and this is actually a variation on Pat's rubber legs. This is, I would say that this pattern here is a fairly typical Pat's rubber legs. It's got a big chunky body. It's using regular chenille. This is a variegated, but the variation is a skinnier pattern, and it uses chenille that would be, this would be your typical size chenille, and it's a much thinner chenille, and it's offered by Fly Fish Food, and it comes in lots of different colors, combinations. This one is a black and tobacco. This one is a black and brown. And the one that we're going to use today is a seal and ginger. So this would be more, represent like a golden stonefly, because those are generally golden on the bottom and brown on top. So we're going to use a fairly large hook today just so you can see it a little bit better. And it has a fairly wide gape. I do tie these on jig hooks a lot of the time, but they're a little trickier to tie because you have a little less room. So first thing I'm going to do is put a tungsten bead on the hook, and today I'm going to use a gold tungsten bead, but I like to use some of the darker colors, black, matte black. I even use a rainbow bead that has some color variation. It's very sweet. So, but I'm going to push the bead back and then start my thread, and I'm just using a 6X or a 140 denier thread in a dark color. You're not really going to see the thread here very much, so I don't think it matters that much what color you use. So I'm going to tie on, not at the regular tie-on point here, but right behind the eye, because the first thing we're going to tie on are the antenna. And then we're going to push the bead over it. So I won't really just want to do a couple of wraps right there. And for the legs, we're going to use this variegated olive rubber material. Sometimes you see it as silly legs or sexy floss. There's a lot of different names for it. So I'm just cutting a piece off the hank here, and then I'm going to cut that piece in half, and I'm going to use that for 1/2 for the antenna and 1/2 for the tail. So I'm going to fold that in half and make a loop. So you want it to be equal. And then I'm just going to do a quick tie-in right here behind the eye. Very, very short amount of material left out of the wraps, and a nice tie-in there. You can adjust it, move it around a little bit, and then you can either tie back down along that bump and sort of smooth it out, which is what I'm going to attempt here, or just snip that off. And now I'm going to tie it off. I'm going to finish it, and because I'm going to move that bead up, I don't want to do a lot of wraps. I just want to get that thread secure and cut it off. So you can see that the antenna are splayed nicely. And then I'm going to take that bead and move it right up, push it right up against the eye of the hook. You can get it right up there. There we go. Okay. And you can see that the bead covers the wraps nicely. Okay, next material is we're going to give it a little bit more weight. So this is definitely a fly you want to fish on the bottom. It's a nymph, stonefly nymphs, and they are often very, very large and heavy. And so we're going to put a little bit more weight on here, 0.015 lead-free wire. And I'm going to hold the end of it against the hook shank, and I'm going to do about 12 wraps. Doesn't matter if they're all tied up against each other right now. So once I get the amount of wraps on it that I want, and you can use heavier wire if you want to, you can make it heavier. And then push that whole assembly right up into the cavity of the bead, and then snip it off. If it's spinning around on the shaft, which it really shouldn't be because it's going to hit some material underneath that bead, you could use a little crazy glue or flex cement, Zap-A-Gap, and you would put that on the shank first and then move the lead wraps up over it, push it in, and hold it for a second. Okay, now we tie our thread on. And so just behind that, this is a very basic technique, is that we're going to create a little thread dam, we call it, right there to push. If it is loose, you could push the lead wraps even further up into the bead with that little dam there, and then come back to about the hook barb and then cut off our tag. The next thing is we're going to grab that second piece of rubber leg, fold it over just like you did for the antenna, and we're going to determine how long we want this fly. So we could use all of that hook shank because they can be big, and we're going to just do a couple of pinch wraps there and tie that right in. Don't worry about how long they are right now because we can trim everything off as to the length that we want when we get there at the end. Okay, looking good. So from here, pretty simple stuff. We're going to take our chenille, and I cut off a piece about 3.5 inches long. You'll get used to how much to use after you do a few. I actually put some ruler marks on my vise, and I measured up against it, and I cut off just as much as I need. And then you see that there's a little difference here between that open hook and the lead wraps. We're going to take up that difference by putting the chenille in that spot. If you want it thicker, then put it through the whole length of the shank. And we're just going to tie that on using nice tight wraps until we get to the hook bend. Tie back up. If there are gaps, you can fill it in with some thread. We're using heavy thread, so it should fill in those gaps pretty nicely. And then we're going to let the thread hang at about the 1/3 mark. So from 1/3 of the hook eye back, leave the thread hanging right there. And then very simple, we're just going to wrap the chenille around the hook shank using nice tight touching wraps. Until we get to our thread, and then tie it off. And we're going to leave the chenille hanging there because we are going to use it for the rest of our thorax. You can just let it sit back like that. Okay, so now we should have another piece of rubber legs, full half of the shank. So in other words, one whole piece would be the length of this. We're going to cut a piece off of here, and then we're going to leave this whole and double it over. But it should be twice as large as the one that we used before. So we have it doubled over. We're going to try to find the midpoint of that and then put that midpoint right up against pretty much where your thread is, and then do a loose wrap, maybe 2 loose wraps right like that. So it's sort of like tucked on there, basted in a way. Now what you want to do is take those legs and move them so that they are right along the hook shank, so they're not at an angle, and you can line them up where you want them. After I do that, I usually take a couple of nice tight turns. Also, you can pull it and take some nice tight turns until you get to the bead. And same thing with the front ones, because these are going to be, the front loop is going to be our front legs. And right at this point, it's certainly okay just to cut it. And you can see that now I have pretty much a nice crisscross of legs. Stoneflies really do have 6 legs, so they would have 3 on each side. But, you know, we say, are they counting? Well, chances are they're not counting. If they're not at a perfect crisscross like this, don't worry about it, because when we wrap the chenille, and I'll do this on the side so you can see it a little better, that chenille is going to take up some of that difference there and help you to place the legs really where you want them. So you can see now it's starting to fill in nicely. And sometimes we can take a turn in front of the legs. For this one, I'm going to just do one more turn behind the legs and then bring it up below the bead and tie it off. And you know, this is not an exact science to me. It's really kind of like how much material can you get on the hook and where do you want it. And you'll get to know where that tie-in point is after you do a couple of them. So do a couple of nice tight turns. I'm having a little tough time because the camera's close. It's hard to get in there. Okay. Now, just like everything else, we're going to cut off that tag end, making sure we don't cut our legs off at the same time. We're going to whip finish it, and so you can, to get them out of the way, you can pull your legs right back, do a couple of nice tight turns behind the bead, and you're really not going to see it because that's going to sink down quite a bit. And then if it's hard to do a whip finish, you could use a half hitch. Sometimes I do that, but I'm not going to be able to get over those rubber legs, am I? So that's not going to be our solution today. So I'm going to do one by hand, just because I think it's going to be easier than getting the tool in there with the camera. This is the hand method for whip finishing. Same thing, just using your fingers instead of the tool, and then cut off your tag. Okay, now we need to clean it up. And the method I use to clean it up is I pull everything up, all the legs up. You can see that they are not even on the top. So I'm going to give them a little, I call it, give them a little haircut. So sometimes I'll just cut them all so that they're the same length. And then I think that the front antenna are pretty good. I'll cut them down a little bit, and the back is not bad either. They should be about the same. And that's pretty much it. It's a nice looking fly. It's very, very simple. There are lots and lots of different leg materials that you can use. I really like these thinner rubber legs. They tend to flutter a little bit more in the water, and they come in lots and lots of different colors, so I would use those. And so I do lots of variations. Some I use with thick legs like these, and others I use with thin. Now the thing about the thicker legs and the length of the legs is, think about it as this fly wants to sink down into the bottom. You don't want too much material to keep it from sinking down efficiently. So, you know, so like our Euro nymphs are very sleek a lot of times, like the Perdigon has no appendages, and so it's going to sink very easily, sort of like, you know, swimmers wear rubber, you know, helmets and skin tight clothes so they can get through the water faster. Well, that's the same idea with the fly. This fly will not sink as much as one that has a skinnier legs and shorter legs. So, you know, really depends on what part of the water column you want to fish it. But that's basically it. To finish it off, I'm just going to put a little dab of head cement right here over my thread wraps, and just let that soak in. And there you have it. Pat's Rubber Legs variation. Thanks a lot.